During the period between the two world wars, the French cavalry was a true state within a state. It ordered its own weapons, including military vehicles. In this, the French cavalrymen were not alone, since a similar situation had developed in Japan and America. Because of this, by the beginning of the Second World War, the French cavalry had its own tanks, different from those ordered by the infantry. The cavalry also possessed reconnaissance tanks that were typical for the 1930s. Unlike the thickly armored and slow light tanks intended for infantry, the cavalry's reconnaissance tanks, officially designated as armored vehicles, could not boast heavy armor, but their speed was twice as high. These were part of a family of combat vehicles that, although not numerous, were quite diverse. Initially, the French cavalry had no intention of acquiring tanks. The armored vehicles in service with the French army were completely unsuitable for units where high mobility was essential. There was no real alternative other than the armored car. This did not prevent the cavalry from occasionally turning its attention to tanks that could, at least in theory, offer good mobility. For example, to the Renault, which at first looked promising but soon proved disappointing. Meanwhile, in the first half of the 1920s, the cavalry received its first armored cars that could fully serve as wheeled tanks. The first of them was a Citroën vehicle built on a half-track chassis. Further development in this direction led to the creation of the Schneider model, the first mass-produced vehicle under the armored car program. In many respects, this half-track vehicle, weighing about 15,000 pounds, fully deserved to be called a wheeled, or in this case, half-track, tank. The next step came on July 4, 1930, when the French cavalry launched its motorization program. Among the planned designs was a light reconnaissance vehicle armed with a machine gun. Conceptually, this vehicle followed the British tankette, a light, two-seat combat vehicle. In 1931, it began to be referred to as an all-terrain vehicle, a light armored car intended for close combat. Soon after, on January 16, 1932, the name changed again, now to Reconnaissance Armored Vehicle. Initially, the competition was won by the half-tracked Citroën with a production batch of 50 units. This was more of a temporary compromise. The Citroën vehicles that entered service in 1933 were made of unarmored steel and were intended solely for training purposes. Fortune smiled upon the Renault company, which at that time was the leader of French tank manufacturing. Things were already going well for the company as production had begun on the Renault Transporter based on the British tankette. Initially, Renault developed its armored car on the basis of this transporter, but by early 1932, a new project had appeared. According to the specifications, the tracked reconnaissance vehicle was to have a combat weight of about 7,700 pounds, armor thickness of 1/3 of an inch, later increased to 1/2 of an inch, and armament consisting of a machine gun mounted in a rotating turret with a crew of 2 men. The vehicle's maximum speed reached about 22 miles per hour. That same year, 1932, 5 experimental prototypes were built to test different technical solutions. Various modifications were introduced during the trials. Despite some problems, on March 8, 1933, the French cavalry officially adopted the tank under the designation AMR-33. An order was immediately placed for 45 units, and in total 118 were produced. Of these, 115 were delivered in 1933 and the remaining 3 in 1934. For its time, it turned out to be quite a good reconnaissance tank, with performance that far exceeded the initial requirements. The maximum speed could reach 37 miles per hour for short periods, while under normal engine operation it achieved 28 miles per hour. Its range was about 124 miles. However, it failed to meet the original weight requirement. It reached 12,000 pounds. Overall, this French tank belonged to roughly the same category as the British light tanks of that era, such as the light tank Mark IV, as well as the German Panzer I. Among the total production count, 3 of the 5 experimental prototypes were included. Yet the fate of the remaining 2 vehicles turned out to be somewhat different. During trials in the spring of 1933, several issues emerged. In the report dated April 21st, the engine was specifically noted. It was placed to the right of the driver, which not only reduced space in the control and fighting compartments, but also disturbed the balance of the center of gravity. This was especially noticeable when driving over rough terrain. An exchange of letters began between Brigadier General Jean Flavigny, who commanded the French cavalry, and François Lehidoux, the right-hand man of Louis Renault. A proposal arose to redesign the chassis, specifically to move the engine from the center of the hull to the rear. Two prototypes were used for this purpose. The tanks were modified differently. The first prototype had its rear section extended by 8 inches, and the engine was moved to the back. Because of this, the radiator and its air intake were shifted to the left. The engine itself became significantly more powerful, an 8-cylinder unit producing 28 horsepower. With it, on February 21, 1934, the tank reached an impressive 45 miles per hour. However, this version was rejected. The engine was not only more powerful, but also larger and more complex. Besides, the tank already had sufficient mobility for its intended role. The second prototype received a more modest engine, a 4-cylinder Renault with a displacement of just under 360 cubic inches and an output of 82 horsepower. The same engine was installed in a light Renault tank that was undergoing trials at the time. It would later evolve into the well-known Renault R35. As on the first machine, the hull and cooling system were redesigned. During trials held from April 3rd to April 11th, 1934, the tank reached 40 miles per hour. This performance fully satisfied the cavalry. On May 15, 1934, the tank was officially adopted under the designation AMR-35. The experimental work did not end there. In September 1934, a third prototype entered testing. At this time built completely from scratch, it differed greatly from its predecessors. A protrusion for the radiator appeared at the rear of the hull, and an air intake was installed on the right side of the turret's front plate. The overall hull length increased to 12 feet 7 inches. The suspension was redesigned following the layout of another Renault tank. Both the drive and idler wheels were changed. In short, Renault's engineers carried out a thorough reworking of the chassis. In its final version, the tank received a Renault engine producing 22 horsepower, the same as that of the serial Renault R35. After all modifications, the combat weight increased to 14,300 pounds, while the maximum speed reached 34 miles per hour. The average speed on the highway was lower, about 25 miles per hour, though wheeled armored cars were only slightly faster. When speaking of the Renault ZT, one cannot ignore its competitors. After January 16, 1932, when requirements for a new reconnaissance armored car were issued, an unspoken rivalry began among manufacturers. Initially, Renault and Citroën competed with each other. However, as already mentioned, the half-track design was quickly rejected. But on January 29, 1934, a new competitor appeared for testing. This machine was called Gendron, and in this case, the term armored car was no exaggeration. Engineer Gendron, the author of this design, truly created an armored vehicle, no less unconventional than Citroën's model P28. Instead of the traditional nosed armored cars usually built on truck chassis, Gendron created something unique. To begin with, the engine was placed in the rear part of the vehicle, which allowed its overall dimensions to be reduced. The front wheels had a transverse leaf spring as a suspension element, and it was attached directly to the hull. The rear wheel was formally a single unit, but in reality, Gendron made it double. There were also additional small support wheels in the central part of the hull that could be lowered and engaged when needed. The vehicle carried the same Avis turret number 1 as used on other French reconnaissance tanks. The power plant was a 296 cubic inch engine producing 70 horsepower, quite sufficient for a vehicle weighing 9,480 pounds. During the tests, it turned out that Gendron's armored car had very good mobility. The maximum speed reached 44 miles per hour, and the average speed on paved roads was 25 miles per hour. However, the idea of the double rear wheel was not well received, and the engineer was advised to redesign his armored car. Gendron did not give up. At the beginning of 1935, he presented an updated version of his vehicle. It now had a conventional four-wheel layout, which significantly changed the shape of its rear section. The support rollers were also redesigned. Instead of solid metal drums, ordinary wheels with pneumatic tires were introduced. Joint trials with a competitor from Renault showed that Gendron's machine clearly outperformed its rival. Based on the test results, it was recommended for serial production. The military units were also satisfied with it. Yet one problem remained. Gendron had no production base of his own. That is why cooperation began between Gendron and the Somua company, to which we will return later. The third participant in this unexpected competition was Citroën. After the relative failure of the P28 model, Citroën developed an entirely new vehicle, this time a fully tracked one. However, nobody intended to abandon the ideas of Adolphe Caigres. A close look at the running gear of Citroën's P103 reconnaissance tank easily reveals features characteristic of the company's earlier half-track tractors. The famous rubber fabric track with rubber metal shoes, the distinctive drive sprocket, and other familiar components remained. Still, the suspension was significantly redesigned, though some elements were borrowed from the previous P28. By the way, the 67 horsepower engine was also taken from that unsuccessful predecessor. Unveiled at the beginning of 1935, the Citroën P103 reconnaissance tank stood out for its originality, not only in the running gear, but also in the hull design. Its front section was cast, and the driver's hatch slid inward along guide rails into the control compartment. The thickness of the front armor plate was 0.79 inches, while the combat weight and overall dimensions remained similar to earlier models. Overall, it was an interesting and promising machine. On April 24, 1935, the Citroën P103 was officially recognized as meeting the requirements of the Reconnaissance Armored Vehicle Program. The French cavalry was ready to place an order for production, but in 1934, Citroën became deeply indebted, and control of the company passed to Michelin. The tire manufacturer considered military projects unpromising and shut them down. Even the Citroën Caigres half-tracks fell out of favor. One of their models was taken over by the Unic company. As for the Citroën P103 reconnaissance tank, no one was able to continue its development. As a result, Renault's competitors withdrew from the race. Finally, the final version of the contract provided for 4 types of tank. The first variant was 12 light reconnaissance tanks with the first model turret and a radio station. In addition to the main machine gun, they were fitted with an anti-aircraft machine gun on a special rotating mount. The second variant was 31 tanks with a large caliber machine gun in the second model turret and a radio station. The third variant was 49 identical tanks with the large caliber machine gun but without a radio station. The last 8 vehicles were command tanks, a special version for the squadron commander with a larger 2-man turret. The armament consisted of a man-portable machine gun, which was mounted in the same way as the rear-facing machine gun on other armored vehicles. The tank was equipped with 2 radio stations, one of which had an antenna on the turret roof. The command tank was first discussed in mid-June 1934, and ultimately it was included in the main contract. All these changes resulted in the contract being executed considerably later than originally planned. It is not surprising that with the next order, the cavalry command did not hurry. In addition, the increase in production volumes had to be fought for with the military ministry. Because of this, the discussion about a new series began only in December 1935. The proposal concerned 30 vehicles, and the suggested list did not include the version with the second model turret. In the end, the new agreement was signed only on April 20, 1936, and it introduced modifications that had not existed before. From the previously produced versions, there were 15 radio tanks with first model turrets, as well as 5 command tanks. Another 5 tanks from the new contract represented an entirely new type. In 1935, the idea appeared to strengthen units equipped with light reconnaissance tanks with specialized tank destroyers. The thing was that the penetration capability of the large caliber machine guns was still insufficient, and the French themselves had increased the thickness of their tank's armor to 1.6 inches. Similar changes were expected from the most likely opponent, Germany, which from 1935 stopped pretending to abide by the prohibitions of the Versailles Treaty. For such purposes, the best option was the 1-inch gun. It could penetrate armor 1.6 inches thick from a distance of 1,300 feet. However, the French Cavalry Command did not have a single opinion on which variant to put into serial production. As a result, it was decided to create a new turret housing a 1-inch gun with a coaxial machine gun. Thanks to the turret's full rotation, high-fire maneuverability was provided, but there was one catch. The ammunition load was only 50 rounds for the gun, which was clearly insufficient. These vehicles were decided to be produced specifically for units armed with light reconnaissance tanks. In parallel, a second tank destroyer was developed. It had no turret. The gun was mounted to the right of the driver mechanic's position. The fire maneuverability was significantly lower, but the ammunition load increased to 80 rounds. After discussion, these vehicles were decided to be assigned to motorized units that were equipped with towed anti-tank guns. The next contract was signed on October 9, 1936. It provided for the production of 30 line tanks with first-type turrets, another 30 radio-equipped tanks with the same turrets, as well as 5 tanks of the second type and the same number of the third type. General Flavigny had ambitious plans for further purchases of these reconnaissance tanks, but for Renault, a dark period began. First, in 1936, a very difficult financial situation forced the nationalization of Renault's tank production. That was how the AMX company appeared. Second, these reconnaissance tanks gained an unexpected rival that became their death sentence. Back in November 1935, the French cavalry adopted the light Hotchkiss tank, better known as the H-35. Having lost the competition for the infantry tank, Hotchkiss managed to win in the field of light cavalry tanks. Not as fast as the Renault reconnaissance tank, it nevertheless had thicker armor, and as later events showed, the cavalry had made the right choice. As a result, the Renault reconnaissance tank family was limited to a modest production run of 200 vehicles. However, the story of the Renault ZT tanks did not end there. The agile reconnaissance vehicle attracted the attention of the Colonial ministry. At that time, the main French colonial tank was the Renault FT, morally outdated since the late 1920s. Something more mobile was needed, and the Renault ZT tank perfectly fit that role. It only remained to make changes related to the specifics of the regions where these tanks were planned to be used. On October 9, 1936, a contract was signed for the production of 21 tanks of the Colonial modification. All the vehicles were equipped with radios but differed in armament and turret types. 3 tanks were fitted with first-type turrets, while the rest inherited turrets from old Renault FT tanks. 12 with 37mm guns, about 1.5 inches, and 6 with 8mm Hotchkiss machine guns, about 0.3 inches. Thus, the Colonial Ministry saved money. The chassis largely matched the base model, but the cooling system was significantly improved. The Colonial variant is easy to recognize by its greater number of air intakes. In 1937, an additional order followed for 3 radio-equipped tanks with first-type turrets. Finally, in April 1938, a contract was signed for the production of another 31 tanks with first-type turrets, 55 units in total. All these contracts, as with most French tanks, were executed in a very peculiar way. Renault was already struggling to meet production programs for the R-35 infantry tanks and the heavy B-1Bs tanks, so the cavalry and especially the Colonial Ministry were of lower priority. Actual deliveries of the base reconnaissance tanks to the troops began in April 1936 and ended 2 years later. The second and third type tank destroyers reached the Army even later, in 1939. As for the Colonial tanks, the situation was disastrous. At best, only a few individual vehicles were completed, and some were produced without turrets at all. It is also worth mentioning another vehicle that was related to the Renault ZT tank program. This was the Renault YS, originally developed on the basis of the Renault VM as a transport vehicle. Later, it attracted interest as a platform for artillery observation vehicles. Although the designation remained the same, all the internal components, from the running gear to the power unit, in the new Renault YS variant were taken from the Renault ZT tanks. Only the concept remained: a front-mounted power plant and a relatively spacious fighting compartment in the rear of the vehicle. According to the contract dated April 14, 1934, 10 such combat vehicles were to be produced. A small dispute broke out between departments. As a result, the cavalry received 2 vehicles, while the tank and artillery branches got 4 each. Deliveries to the troops, however, did not begin until the end of 1937. In July 1936, the idea arose to create a second version of the vehicle, Renault YS2. They did not build it from scratch. Instead, they used one of 2 prototypes of the original transporter. Technically, the second version duplicated the production vehicles. The only difference was the installation of a mock-up turret with a rangefinder and special optics. The vehicle was manufactured, more precisely converted, by January 1937, after which it was tested by various agencies. The Cavalry became the final destination for this novelty. Despite the termination of the Light Reconnaissance Vehicle program, its story did not end, because the aforementioned designer Gendron found himself a companion. That companion turned out to be the company Somua, a subsidiary of the armaments giant Schneider Krauss. In the person of a talented Somua engineer, the firm found someone able to realize the company's ambitions in the field of armored vehicle construction. In turn, Gendron gained the manufacturing capabilities of Somua. In December 1937, the second experimental sample of the armored car went out for trials and received the designation AM39 Gendron-Somua. The overall concept remained unchanged, but the vehicle itself was seriously revised. The hull became more manufacturable, with casting used partially. The armored car was driven by a more powerful 79 horsepower engine. Although the combat weight increased to about 13,900 pounds, mobility proved quite respectable, and the operational range rose to 211 miles. Testing of the second experimental sample continued until August 1938, and based on the results, the Cavalry expressed satisfaction. This was precisely the reconnaissance armored car it needed. Of course, there existed a promising next-generation armored vehicle project. The development program was launched in March 1938, and its result was the Panhard 201, an extremely interesting vehicle that later formed the basis of the post-war Panhard EBR. The other question was that a new armored car was needed here and now. On September 2, 1939, the joint Gendron and Somua development was adopted into service with the French Cavalry as the AM39 Gendron-Somua. From August to December 1940, it was planned to receive 150 armored cars of this type. The final variant of the vehicle was ready by the end of 1939. Overall, the chassis repeated the experimental example. Later, it received a tail where the radio station was placed. If on the second experimental sample the turret roll was served by ballast, the final version of the armored car was fitted with a turret armed with a 25mm gun. Thus, an analog of the light reconnaissance vehicle AMR-35 with a gun emerged, but it was much more mobile. The vehicle's average speed was 32 miles per hour, maximum 43 miles per hour. The armored car turned out to be faster and smaller than the Panhard 178, which at that time was the main French armored car. They shared one drawback: weak armor protection. That proved fatal to the fate of the AM39 Gendron-Somua. On February 27, 1940, General Maurice Gamelin essentially buried the armored car. The reason was armor that was too weak. By that time, the first experimental sample of the Panhard 201 had just been completed, which had armor 1.6 inches thick installed at rational angles of inclination. Naturally, Gamelin backed the Panhard 201. An order for 600 of these armored cars was placed on May 1, 1940. Hardly anyone could have predicted that 1.5 months later, France would suffer defeat in the Second World War. By the original plan, the light reconnaissance tanks AMR were to become the most numerous type of combat vehicles within French light mechanized divisions. General Flavigny planned that each motorized dragoon regiment would have 3 divisions, and an escadron of these reconnaissance tanks would be attached to each. In addition, 2 escadrons of such vehicles were planned to be included in each cavalry brigade regiment, of which there were only 2. Summarizing the situation at the end of 1933, a light mechanized division was to include 7 escadrons of reconnaissance tanks AMR, plus 4 escadrons of heavier armored cars AMC. When the AMR-35 model with its turret finally began to enter service, the situation had already changed. First, instead of AMC armored cars, the Army started receiving Somua S-35 tanks. Second, as mentioned earlier, in November 1935, the cavalry adopted the Hotchkiss H-35 tank. These vehicles began arriving in July 1936, just 2 months after the first deliveries of the AMR-35 reconnaissance tanks. The situation worsened because deliveries of these reconnaissance vehicles were slow. The last tanks only arrived at the end of 1938. Against this background, the products of the Hotchkiss Company looked much more attractive. By September 1938, deliveries of H-35 tanks had already been completed. Out of 400 tanks, 100 went to the infantry, which had initially rejected them but later began to appreciate their value. Summing up all these changes around the reconnaissance tank program, even the 1st Light Mechanized Division, commanded by Flavigny, had a completely different composition than initially planned. The most numerous type of light cavalry tank there was the Hotchkiss H-35, as many as 94 vehicles. Instead of AMC armored cars, the division had 96 Somua S-35 tanks. As for the AMR-35 reconnaissance tanks, by the end of August 1939, there were 40 units plus 20 in reserve, along with 2 older Renault ADF-1 reconnaissance vehicles and 1 more in reserve. All these machines were concentrated in the 4th Motorized Dragoon Regiment, which was equipped with 6-wheeled all-wheel drive Lafley S-20 LT trucks, in fact produced mainly by the same Hotchkiss company. These trucks were used both as transport for motorized infantry and as artillery tractors for 25mm, about 1-inch anti-tank guns. The same composition was found in the 1st Motorized Dragoon Regiment, part of the 2nd Light Mechanized Division. Finally, 40 reconnaissance tanks plus 2 older Renault ADF-1 vehicles, along with 7 reconnaissance tanks and 5 ADF-1 vehicles in reserve, were in the 1st Armored Car Detachment of the 1st Cavalry Division. As can be seen, there were no specialized tank destroyers here since their production was delayed. By the beginning of hostilities, that is by May 10, 1940, the composition of the units armed with reconnaissance tanks had changed. The 1st and 4th Motorized Dragoon Regiments had been reinforced. Now they had 3 squadrons with 22 tanks each, plus 1 older Renault ADF-1 reconnaissance vehicle. Another squadron, 22 AMR-35 reconnaissance tanks, was transferred to the 5th Motorized Dragoon Regiment, which was part of the 5th Light Cavalry Division. The remaining vehicles were either in the city of Saumur or in reserve. As for the tank destroyers, they were distributed among the reconnaissance groups of infantry divisions. For example, the 7th Reconnaissance Group had 20 AMR-35 tanks, including vehicles of the ZT-3 model with reinforced armament. The turreted ZT-2 tank destroyers went to the 1st Reconnaissance Group. These reconnaissance groups were used to complete mechanized divisions. Finally, similar units also received the very few ZT-4 model tank destroyers that had managed to be equipped with turrets in time. The main mass of AMR-35 reconnaissance tanks ended up engaged in battles in the Ardennes. Considering that half of the vehicles were armed only with rifle-caliber machine guns and the other half could fight only against light tanks, the fate of these reconnaissance tanks was predictable. They often became the backdrop for German soldiers posing for photographs next to destroyed and burned out French machines. Unlike other French light tanks, this particular version of the vehicle attracted almost no interest from the Germans. In March 1941, the surviving machines that fell into German hands received a new designation. However, there were so few of them that even the isolated examples were not considered seriously for any practical use. Moreover, a tank armed only with a machine gun and armored just enough to stop bullets was suitable only for auxiliary tasks. Strangely enough, the captured French Colonial tanks armed with a 25mm cannon had a much longer service history. The last time these machines were used was in May 1945 by the insurgent citizens of Prague during the city's liberation. The reason for the prolonged use of these tanks lies in the fact that some of them were captured directly at the factories or found abandoned, without turrets. They were fitted with other French-made turrets. One vehicle was converted into a self-propelled mortar, which was also used on Czech territory. This particular example was captured by the Americans in May 1945, and, like the rest of the vehicles of this type, it disappeared without a trace. Such was the sad end of a combat vehicle whose fate had been difficult from the very beginning.